Zensurance is Canada's leading business insurance broker, providing all kinds of contractors and small business owners in the construction industry with the coverage they need in just a few minutes. We shop over 50 insurance providers to ensure that contractors, trade professionals, and construction companies get the lowest possible price. Simply visit zensurance.com/DCN, and in just a few minutes, you could save up to 35% on the customized policy you need. That's zensurance.com/DCN. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Construction Record Podcast. I'm Warren Frey, and with me today I have.
Alex Carrick. Pleasure for me to be here.
Oh, no problem. Thanks, Alex. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at Alex's crystal ball / analysis for 2022, what he thinks from 2021 and beforehand will affect what we're doing in 2022 with the industry, and what 2022 has in store for us from an economic point of view. So, Alex, to start with, what do you think from the last couple of years, other than the big obvious COVID, and including the obvious COVID, what's going to keep with us and affect the economy in 2022?
Yeah, well, you kind of have to start with COVID and Omicron and what's going on there and whether or not we get past it. I mean, that's the thing. Back in the fall of last year, my wife and I were going out to restaurants and we went to a couple of movies and we thought, okay, this seems to be behind us, and it was wonderful. We were just getting back into the swing, and I thought it was great. And then suddenly Omicron from out of nowhere popped up, and it's thrown a lot of things into uncertainty again. If January ends up being the peak for it, and in Quebec and Ontario, the number of cases are already down versus what they were a week ago. They're still about as high as they were as they've gotten in this period in Alberta and BC. So those provinces will have to start making some recoveries as well. But hopefully by February, March, things will be starting to return more to normal. At which time there's every reason to be quite optimistic about the economy.
And how does, like, I know there's knock-on effects. I know supply chain problems from the beginning of the pandemic are still affecting us now. So what are some things that are kind of still lurking even if we get out of the pandemic itself?
Well, you're absolutely right. The supply chain one is certainly a big issue, and inflation. I mean, inflation in the United States is 7% uh, year over year, in the consumer price index, and that's really kind of outrageous. And central bankers and politicians, they're kerfuffle trying to figure out what they can do to fix this,
Hmm.
and probably not going to be able to fix it in the short term. But it's not just inflation. That's the other thing that I'd really point out, that there's something else going on behind the scenes, which is significant as well, and that is that there's a lot of things that are adding to costs and expenses and so on. The the companies have to do things that they didn't used to have to do. They have to have compliance courses, and they have to keep up with technology, and that's expensive. And they're gonna if they have fleets of cars, they're probably going to have to buy electric cars, and that's expensive. And they've got to spend money decarbonizing their production processes, and that's money that's taken away from expanding footprint and increasing capacity. And if you increases to capacity are the old standard way that you dealt with inflation, because if you produce more, then you keep the price down. But if you're not producing more and you're spending your capital funds in other areas, then that takes away from the fight against inflation. And in so many areas, I mean, society is changing too. I mean, people are ordering in dinners. If you're ordering a dinner, that's not the same as having mac and cheese at night. It's a lot more
Hmm.
expensive than opening a can of soup or having mac and cheese and so on. So it's becoming an increasingly expensive world that we're living in. So that's one of the things that's going to linger. And then, of course, there's a bunch of other issues that are still hanging out there. which I'd be happy to go into.
Well, one thing you mentioned was technology, keeping up with technology. We're all still working from home, and we all think, well, that's got to be cheaper. But I bet you that there's ways that it isn't cheaper, at least for companies, and that for governments, they've got all these infrastructure projects that probably depend on people going into work, and that's kind of on a dime change for them. So how does that affect the economy?
Well, yeah, you think that working from home is cheaper. Well, that's true, but there's always new things that are coming, like the 5G networks are coming, and there's always new advances that are coming, and companies feel to stay competitive that they got to invest in those things. Now, from a construction point of view, it's always good from a construction point of view to flip things over and look at things from another side,
Mhm.
and that is. Uh, if companies need more technology and more equipment and that sort of thing, then that means that they've got to have some place to house that equipment. Um, the best example I can give of flipping things over is one of those items that will be adding to expenses and will be adding to costs, and that's the fact that commodity prices have been reviving. The whole movement towards decarbonization in the world means that there's going to be more demand for things like nickel and copper for batteries and for transmission lines and lithium and all these rare earths and all that sort of stuff. And one can say, oh gosh, that's not great because that's going to increase costs and how that's going to slow down the economy. I mean, the price of oil is way up versus what it was
Mhm.
a year ago. But on this whole topic area of flipping things over and looking at things from a different perspective, if you've got higher prices for commodities, raw materials, that means that there's an incentive for owners to go ahead and make investment plans and go ahead with those mega projects that we have not seen in Canada for more than a decade. And already there are things like big gold mine has been been announced, potash Jansen mine in Saskatchewan. And Dow has got a petrochemical plant that they're building in Fort Saskatchewan, and and so that's positive for construction from that angle, and it's also positive for the economy in a lot of ways too, because if you got higher prices for these commodities, what Canada is really all about is trade, and it's the gap between the exports of major resources and the imports of those resources. And there's a huge gap in Canada's favor. And so if you've got higher prices, that gap widens, and that means a surplus in foreign trade. And a surplus in foreign trade contributes directly to the bottom line of gross domestic product. So, so you gotta look at these things from more than one angle.
And just, I remember reading somewhere that because of people staying at home, a lot of people paid off their household debt, but now that's kind of come creeping back because they were started renovating and for various other reasons. And so that might tie into what you're saying about things getting more expensive too. But in terms of commercial and residential building and people migrating out of big cities, because that's apparently been happening as well, how does that factor into the economy?
Yeah, well, that's certainly apparently happening. There's talk about the populations of some of the biggest cities in Canada, that the populations, the downtown population, downtown core populations have been decreasing, and people have been moving to suburbs around the cities, and then also further afield than that. I mean, you can probably think of a number of people that you know that have moved out
Hmm.
of Vancouver to someplace else. And certainly I can think of 4 or 5 people that I know directly who have moved to further up north to Collingwood, Meaford area in Ontario. And I've got relatives who have moved to the Atlantic.
Hmm.
And so that is happening. And if you look at housing starts, uh, there's been a huge boom in housing starts this year. I mean, my goodness, there's never been anything like it, and that's because of what you were suggesting. People didn't have any place else to spend their money back in 2020, in 2021 to some degree, but more in 2020, and so they were able to accumulate down payments faster, and that helped with purchasing. That's helped with purchasing homes, and it's driven housing starts. Housing starts in 2021. I believe there were 4 months where housing starts were 300,000 units or more. And we've never seen anything like that. I mean, the highest number on a monthly annualized basis before last year was 278,000 back before the 2008 2009 recession. So 4 months and 4 months last year at over 300,000. That's incredible. I don't think anybody would have believed that would be possible. The average monthly figure last year was 276,000, which is an increase of one quarter over 2020's 218,000. So there's been this incredible upsurge in housing activity. So that's one of the things that's being driven by a high savings rate, by the low interest rate, by people moving out of the cities to other centers. You see, the funniest thing, and funny is not the right word, but the
Hmm.
strangest thing about the housing boom is housing in Canada is almost always led by Toronto. But Toronto still had the highest unit starts last year, but Toronto's increase was only 9% in terms of units. And and the big increases in terms of the number of units were in centers around Toronto. It was Hamilton and Kitchener, and even as far afield as London, and up north in Barrie, and so on. And so there was this huge boom in housing starts, but it wasn't really driven by Toronto. Calgary had a really big increase in housing starts, and Montreal did well as did well also, and Vancouver was okay. Edmonton and Ottawa, among Canada's 6 cities with populations of 1 million or more each, it was Edmonton and Edmonton and Ottawa. Ottawa had done very well the year before, so Ottawa wasn't nearly as strong last year as in 2020.
And just in terms of offices, because once the pandemic hit, people had all these, and presumably still do in a lot of cases, have these empty offices. And so, how does that's got to have a knock-on effect of some sort, because we're hitting year three more or less of the pandemic, and they've still got empty offices, and they're still probably paying for them. So how does that affect the economy as a whole?
Yeah, well, it's hard to imagine that there's going to be any real uh, surge in office building construction. I mean, that's kind of hard to imagine. There's going to be companies that are going to go ahead anyway because they're going to say, well, we're gonna fight the trend or whatever, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to have something that's going to appeal to a lot of companies. But hotel and motel construction and offices, I'm not sure how you can really jump back on board uh, in terms of your enthusiasm about those
Hmm.
markets just yet. Maybe, in another year or so, maybe. So there's a lot of areas like that. Now, here's an interesting thought too. When you're talking about residential and you're talking about the shift in residential, I talked about residential being so strong. That strength has come not in urban cores. That has been more the single family market, and it's been people moving outside city cores. Rapid transit. Almost every major city in Canada has, and actually I think really every major city in Canada has plans for some major rapid transit expansion. But the
Hmm.
way that those projects work is because of a symbiotic relationship between transportation hubs at rapid transit stations. And the way that of course works is that if you build high-rise buildings at a transportation hub, and think any place you like Eglinton Young or or to
Yeah,
pick your
there's
city. And
examples here too. Yep.
yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, pick your city. And there's once a station goes in, the developers come in and they build these multifamily units. And the multifamily units, there's an appeal to live in these multifamily units because there's transit nearby. And at the same time, there's an appeal to build the units because you know that people are going to be able to get to work and so on. So they feed on each other. There's this symbiotic relationship between them. But if commuter patterns have been changed because more people are working from home and more people are outside city cores, it'll be interesting to see whether the rapid transit, the huge volumes, the billions of dollars that's being planned for rapid transit actually materializes. And I suspect that it probably will, but it'll probably take longer for these projects to pay off in terms of development around the hubs than it has in the past. So there's going to be all kinds of things that we're going to be watching uh, to see what transpires over time. And it's the same for airports. A lot of airports have plans for big expansions, but in terms of air travel, well, air travel in Canada is still nothing like back to where it
Oh
was
yeah.
before the pandemic. It is in the States, funnily enough. I mean, the last time I looked, the number of passengers being cleared by TSA, which is a security agency there, about 80% of what it was before the pandemic. And so Americans are back traveling. Uh, but again, we swing back to the whole story about
Mhm.
when are we going to be through Omicron? And is Omicron going to result in more lockdowns and so on. So Omicron, a medical condition, is influencing the economy like nothing else before in terms of being something that's not strictly economics.
Mhm. Now, you mentioned flights, which fills me with a feeling of dread I didn't have in 2018 when I was flying around all over the place. So maybe we could go into some of the things we should be on the lookout for that are not so great coming our way in 2022, probably from an economics and construction standpoint.
I'm relatively optimistic. The things that we have to worry about uh, are the pandemic. Is it over? Are there going to be new variants of the Omicron virus? The other one that a lot of people will be talking about is inflation and the impact that that'll have on interest rates. Yeah, I'm not as worried about interest rates as all that. Now, maybe I should be because it can have an impact, and it might cause some owners to say, well, you know, maybe I won't go ahead just yet. Maybe I'll wait till things really settle down more. See, in the housing market, the first, almost always historically, when interest rates begin to increase, you get people advancing their plans because they're worried about being caught with even higher mortgage rates. And
Mhm.
so, so that can be an effect. The other thing is interest rates are so low that even if they got up a bit, they're still not going to be anything like they've been historically. The the central bank interest rates are effectively zero, and really the equilibrium interest rate is considered to be somewhere around 3% or 3.5% by central banks. In Canada, it's the overnight rate. In the U.S., it's the federal funds rate. So there's room for interest rates to move up without them necessarily being tremendously harmful to the economy or restrictive or however you want to put it, being hawkish, being tremendously hawkish. But there's other things to be worried about, but there's also a lot of things to be positive about. You see, one of the things that's really an incredible opportunity right now is the enormous disparity between energy prices in North America and other places around the world. The
Mhm.
price of gas, so the price of natural gas in Canada and the United States is like 1/6 what it is in Europe. And likewise in Japan and China, because they're paying for LNG from other countries, Qatar and Australia and so on. And if they were allowed to go ahead with projects, but that gets to be a political issue. If the Canadian producers were allowed to go ahead with projects, and US producers too, as far as that goes, there's this huge cost advantage for oil and natural gas more than oil, because oil is priced globally, but natural gas. So there's a huge price advantage in terms of uh, LNG exporting facilities and fertilizer plants and petrochemical plants. So that's another thing to keep an eye out for. And as I say, we've already had announcements of some major petrochemical work going ahead here. But I'm skeptical that these projects will be allowed to proceed. And Ontario's boldly going ahead with a mini or nuclear plant, supposedly. And it'll be interesting to see whether or not it meets with opposition. Canada's already, there's a Capline pipeline in the United States that is being reversed. And that has meant that a lot more Canadian oil is reaching the Gulf Coast than it was before. And for the first time ever, um, Canada had significant oil exports to countries other than the United States last month. And the primary destination for that oil was India. Flip things over and look at them in a different way. And there's positives. There's a lot of positives.
Okay, Alex, thanks very much for joining us today.
Oh, well, that was terrific. I probably talked too much and probably
Absolutely not.
babbled too much, but thank you very much, Warren. Thank you for the opportunity.
You're welcome, Alex. Zensurance is Canada's leading business insurance broker, providing construction industry contractors and small business owners with the coverage they need in just a few simple minutes. Visit zensurance.com/DCN to get a free quote. You could save up to 35% on your annual premium.